The graveyard key. We never should have gone looking for that key. I know that now. It all started with a legend. One of those stories that gets passed around late at night when the campfire's burning low and the woods are so dark you can't tell where the trees end and the sky begins. The story of the graveyard key. Everyone in town had heard it, but no one had ever been stupid enough to go looking for it. Until us. The legend went something like this. In the old cemetery just outside of town, hidden deep among the crumbling tombstones and forgotten mausoleums, there was a key. Not just any key, mind you, but a special one. One that could open the gates to something far worse than death. The underworld. And according to the tale, if you found the key on Halloween night, the dead would rise from their graves, claw their way out of the earth, and drag you down with them. Forever. We thought it was bullshit. A ghost story meant to keep kids from sneaking into the graveyard after dark. But there was something about it that gnawed at me. Something that made it feel real. And when Halloween rolled around and my friends suggested we go hunting for the key, I didn't say no. It was me, Davis, Ethan, and Kara. 4 people with nothing better to do on a cold October night. We met just after midnight, flashlights in hand, bundled in jackets that did nothing to keep out the chill. The cemetery was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that wraps around you like a second skin, thick and suffocating. No wind, no crickets, just the crunch of dead leaves underfoot and the distant rustle of something moving through the grass. We laughed at first. Nervous jokes, the kind you make when you're too scared to admit you're scared. But the further we walked into the cemetery, the less anyone had to say. It was as if the graves themselves were watching us, waiting. The moon was full, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like they were alive. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. Nothing more. We found the spot easily enough. It was an old mausoleum, hidden behind a tangle of vines and overgrown bushes. The stone was cracked and worn, the name etched into it long faded. It looked like it had been abandoned for centuries, forgotten by the world. But when Davis pushed open the heavy iron door, the hinges groaned like something alive. Inside, it was worse. The air was thick, musty, and cold. So cold that I could see my breath hanging in front of me. A thin white fog that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. The walls were lined with shelves, each one holding an ancient coffin, their lids nailed shut with rusted iron spikes. It smelled of rot, decay, and something else I couldn't place. Something foul and unnatural. The air felt heavy, pressing in on us, and I swear, I could hear a faint whisper coming from the shadows. The key, if it even existed, was supposed to be here, hidden, waiting. Ethan was the first to move, stepping further into the darkness, his flashlight beam bouncing across the stone floor. That's when we heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A scraping, like nails on stone. At first we thought it was Davis, messing with us. He had a habit of pulling stupid pranks when we were on edge. But then from the corner of the room came a low, guttural moan. It wasn't human. Not anymore. Kara screamed, backing toward the entrance, her flashlight flickering as if the batteries were dying. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice trembling, but no one moved. No one could move, because that's when we saw it. The first coffin, the one closest to us. The lid, nailed down with iron spikes for who knows how long, was slowly rising. Something was pushing it open from the inside. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed to get out, but my feet were glued to the spot. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the lid as it scraped open inch by inch. Then the stench hit, the smell of death, so thick and rancid it burned my throat and made my eyes water. And before we could even comprehend what was happening, it sat up. The corpse. Its skin was shriveled, pulled tight over its bones, gray and sagging, and its eyes, those hollow, sunken pits, locked on us. Ethan dropped his flashlight. It shattered, the beam flickering once, twice, and then plunging us into near darkness. In the faint light from Davis's flickering torch, I saw the corpse move, slow and deliberate, as if it hadn't walked in centuries. It stepped out of the coffin, the bones in its neck cracking as it turned its head to look at us. And then it spoke. Its voice was low, a rasping whisper that crawled up my spine and lodged itself in my skull. "The key! You found it!" There was no key. Not yet. But the way it looked at us, like it knew we were about to find it, about to unleash whatever hell this place had been holding back, made my blood run cold. Kara was already bolting for the door, screaming for us to follow. But before we could take a step, the mausoleum's door slammed shut with a deafening clang. I ran to it, pulling, pushing, it wouldn't budge. The metal was ice cold, like it had been frozen shut. and behind me the moaning grew louder. More coffins were opening. Davis was swearing under his breath, hands shaking as he fumbled with his flashlight. And I turned to Ethan, but he was gone. His flashlight lay on the floor, still flickering, but there was no sign of him. "Ethan!" My voice cracked, but there was no answer, just the sound of bones scraping against stone. And that's when I felt it. Something cold, impossibly cold, brushing against the back of my neck. I whipped around, but nothing was there. Nothing but the darkness. We had come looking for a legend, for something that wasn't supposed to exist, but we had found something worse, something waiting, something hungry. And as the dead rose from their graves, I realized the worst part. We weren't getting out of here alive. We had come looking for the key. Now the key was looking for us. The air inside the mausoleum was like a vacuum, heavy and thick, pressing down on us from all sides. The low moaning of the dead seemed to come from everywhere at once, growing louder with every second. My heart was hammering so hard in my chest I thought it would burst, but all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of it all. Davis finally snapped, his voice shaking as he yelled, "We've got to get out of here!" He ran to the door, throwing himself against it with all his weight, but it didn't budge. It was sealed shut, like the mausoleum itself was determined to keep us in, or worse, keep something out. Kara had stopped screaming, but her breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. She was staring at the far corner of the room, her eyes wide and unblinking, fixated on something I couldn't see. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Ethan's gone." I turned my flashlight in the direction she was looking, and my stomach dropped. Where Ethan had been standing, there was nothing but a dark smear on the floor, a black, sticky stain that hadn't been there before. I forced myself to step closer, my legs heavy and slow, like I was wading through molasses. The stain glistened in the weak light, and as I crouched down, the smell hit me. It was the same stench of decay that had filled the room when the first corpse had risen, but now it was stronger, almost alive. And then I saw it. Just beneath the stain, something gleaming. I reached out, my hand shaking, and brushed away the black sludge. It was a key. Not just any key. The key. It was smaller than I'd expected, rusted and ancient, its surface etched with strange, twisted symbols that hurt to look at for too long. It was warm to the touch, like it had been lying in the sun, and as my fingers closed around it, I felt a sharp electric jolt shoot up my arm. Kara screamed again, her voice high-pitched and shrill, and I spun around just in time to see the second corpse. It had crawled halfway out of its coffin, its bony fingers scratching at the stone floor, pulling itself toward us with slow, jerky movements. Its eyes, milky white and clouded, locked onto mine, and I felt an icy wave of dread wash over me. "We have to move," I whispered, barely able to form the words. I stuffed the key into my pocket, not daring to let go of it, and grabbed Kara by the arm, pulling her toward the door. "Davis, help me!" I shouted, but when I turned to look for him, he was gone. Gone, just like Ethan. My blood ran cold. Davis had been right next to me, pounding on the door, but now there was no trace of him, not even a sound. The only thing left was his flashlight, lying on the ground, flickering weakly as it cast long shadows across the room. Something was taking us, one by one. "Where is he?" Kara's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting Davis to materialize out of the shadows. But I knew better. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't human. It wasn't natural, and it wasn't going to stop. I grabbed her hand, yanking her toward the door again, my fingers slick with sweat. "We need to find a way out," I said, my voice hoarse. "Before it—" The sound of footsteps cut me off. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the mausoleum. But they weren't coming from the door. They were coming from behind us, from deeper inside. My heart froze. There was no exit back there. Just more coffins, more death. "Don't look," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Don't look, Kara." But she looked. Of course she did. And when she did, she screamed. I spun around and for a second, just a split second, I saw it. Something huge towering over us, its face hidden in the shadows. It wasn't a corpse. No, this thing was worse. Its body was wrapped in darkness, a writhing mass of something that didn't make sense, shifting in and out of focus. And then, in a flash, it was gone. Kara collapsed, her legs giving out from under her as she sobbed uncontrollably, her hands clutching her head like she was trying to block out the memory of what she'd just seen. But I knew she couldn't. I couldn't either. The moaning was louder now. The coffins were shaking, the nails in their lids creaking as if something inside was trying to break free. The corpses were waking up, one after the other, their rotting bodies jerking and twisting as they clawed their way out of the ground. And then the door swung open. For a moment, I thought we were saved. The cold night air rushed in, clearing the suffocating stench of death, and I could see the moonlight spilling into the mausoleum, lighting up the path to freedom. But then I saw them. They were standing just outside the door, waiting for us. Dozens of them. Shadows, wrapped in tattered burial shrouds, their faces obscured by rotting flesh and empty black eye sockets. They weren't alive, but they weren't quite dead either. They were something in between, something worse, and they were waiting for us. I backed away, pulling Kara with me, but the key in my pocket seemed to burn hotter and hotter with every step I took. It was as if it was calling to them, pulling them closer. We had done something terrible. By finding the key, we had awakened the dead, and now they were coming for us. Suddenly, Kara stopped sobbing. Her breath caught in her throat, and she looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Then, with a sharp, jerking movement, her head snapped to the side, her neck bending at an impossible angle. Her body convulsed violently, and before I could react, something invisible yanked her backward, pulling her into the darkness. I reached out, screaming her name, but it was too late. She was gone. Just like Davis. Just like Ethan. And then in the silence, I heard it again. That voice. Low, guttural, whispering from the shadows. You cannot escape. The key has chosen. I stumbled back, my head spinning, my heart pounding in my ears. The corpses were moving closer, their twisted, mangled bodies dragging themselves across the floor. I looked down at the key, still burning in my hand. It had chosen. But for what? And then it hit me. A cold, sick realization that clawed at my insides. The key wasn't just a tool. It was a curse, and I was the one who had unleashed it. I don't remember running out of the mausoleum. I don't even remember how the door opened wide enough for me to escape. All I know is that one moment, the dead were closing in, and the next, I was stumbling through the fog-covered cemetery, gasping for air. I fell to my knees, the cold dirt digging into my skin as I looked around frantically. It was too quiet, too still, but I could feel them. They were behind me, the dead, waiting, watching. The key in my pocket felt heavier now, as though it was tethering me to something, a weight I couldn't shake. My hands were shaking, slick with sweat and blood. I wasn't sure whose. The darkness had swallowed Kara. Ethan was gone. Davis had vanished without a trace. And me? I was still alive, for now. But it wasn't over. It was never over. I looked down at the ground, trying to gather my thoughts, when I noticed something I hadn't before. There were fresh graves. Too fresh. The soil had been recently disturbed, small mounds of dirt rising from where the bodies had been laid to rest. But that wasn't what made my stomach turn. No, it was the fact that every single grave had been opened, dug up from the inside. The dead had risen, just like the legend said they would. And it was my fault. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady, trying to focus. I needed to get out of here. Needed to get away from this cursed place before it was too late. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. That voice. Low. Whispering. The key! I whipped around, but there was nothing. Just shadows creeping and shifting in the fog. My pulse quickened as the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone at all. Out of the mist, a figure stepped forward. At first, I thought it was one of the corpses. Another twisted, decaying thing risen from its grave. But this one was different. Its skin wasn't rotting. Its eyes weren't hollow. It looked human, but something was wrong. Horribly wrong. It was too clean, too perfect, like a mannequin dressed up to look alive. The figure's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach its eyes. You found the key, it said, its voice eerily calm. I took a step back, my heart racing. Who are you? I demanded, my voice shaky. What do you want? The figure tilted its head, still smiling. I want nothing. It's the key that wants you. The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I clutched the key tighter in my pocket, the metal burning against my skin. What the hell are you talking about? The figure took a step closer, its smile widening. The key is a doorway, it said softly. You've opened it. Now the dead will come, and they will keep coming. You cannot stop it. I backed away, my breath quickening. No, that's not possible. I didn't... My words faltered as I looked around the cemetery, at the graves, at the fog. The dead were coming. They were already here. The figure's eyes glinted in the moonlight, and for the first time, I noticed something terrifying. Its eyes were the same milky white as the corpses in the mausoleum. It wasn't alive. You've unleashed them, the figure continued, its voice growing softer, more menacing. "And now you must face the consequence." Before I could move, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I stumbled, trying to regain my balance, but the earth was moving, crawling, as if something was pushing its way up from below. I looked down in horror as skeletal hands burst from the soil, clawing their way to the surface. One after another, they emerged, bodies long buried, their bones creaking and cracking as they pulled themselves from their graves. The air was thick with the stench of death, a foul, putrid smell that filled my lungs and made me gag. They were everywhere, crawling, moaning. The dead, hungry for something I couldn't give them. And all I had was the key. The figure stood there, watching, smiling as the dead surrounded me. I could hear their bones rattling, their fingers scraping against the stone, but there was no way out. I was trapped. Then the figure spoke again, its voice low and guttural. "Do you want to live?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a question. It was a promise. I could feel it, the weight of those words pressing down on me, wrapping around me like a noose. "Give me the key," the figure whispered, "and I'll let you live." The key burned hotter in my pocket, as if it knew what was happening, as if it was alive and it didn't want to let go. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the dead. The figure's smile faded. Its eyes grew darker, colder. "You don't understand," it said, stepping closer. "You can't stop this. You've already opened the door. The key is useless now." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "Then why do you want it?" The figure's lips twisted into a sneer. "Because I know what it is. I know what it can do." It leaned in closer, its breath cold against my skin. "And I know what it will cost you." I took a step back, clutching the key in my hand. "Stay away from me," I warned, but my voice lacked conviction. I didn't even believe it myself. The figure laughed, a hollow, bone-chilling sound that echoed through the cemetery. "You think you have a choice?" it hissed. "There are no choices here, only death." Before I could react, the ground beneath me cracked open. A deep, jagged fissure split the earth, and from within it, a hand, long, bony, and impossibly large, shot up, wrapping around my ankle. I screamed, but it was no use. The hand was dragging me down, pulling me toward the gaping maw of the underworld. My fingers scrambled for purchase, but there was nothing to hold on to. Nothing but the cold, hard ground. And then the figure was beside me, its hand outstretched. "Give me the key," it whispered, its voice soft, seductive. "Give it to me and I will set you free." I hesitated, the key burning in my palm. I could feel the cold grip of the underworld tightening around me, pulling me deeper, dragging me down. The dead were closing in, their moans growing louder, their fingers clawing at the earth. And then, just as I was about to hand over the key, I saw it, a flicker of movement behind the figure. A shadow, dark and twisted, rising from the ground. It wasn't part of the dead. It wasn't from the underworld. It was something else. Something worse. The figure froze, its smile faltering as the shadow loomed over it. For the first time, I saw fear in its eyes. The shadow reached out, its long skeletal fingers wrapping around the figure's throat. It didn't scream. It didn't even try to fight. It just crumpled to the ground, its body withering and decaying in an instant, like it had been waiting for this moment all along. And as the shadow turned its empty, hollow eyes toward me, I realized with a sickening certainty, the key wasn't the only thing that had been locked away. I had set something else free, something far worse, and it was coming for me next. The shadow loomed closer, its twisted skeletal form flickering in and out of the mist like a nightmare refusing to fully take shape. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I could barely breathe as it crept toward me. The earth was still shifting beneath me, and the dead were clawing their way out of the graves, but the presence of the shadow made them seem almost afraid. For a moment I didn't move. I couldn't. My fingers gripped the key so tightly that I thought it would fuse with my skin. The cold, burning sensation in my hand was unbearable, but I held on, feeling as if it was my last connection to life itself. The shadow stopped inches from me, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. I expected terror, expected to feel the weight of death bearing down on me, pulling me into its darkness. But what I felt was calm. The air seemed to still, the chaos around me muted. I stood breathless, waiting for the final blow, but it never came. The shadow extended its hand toward me, fingers long and thin, but it didn't grab me. It simply hovered there, palm open. I stared at it, unsure of what to do. In the distance, I could still hear the moaning of the dead, but it felt farther away now, less immediate. The shadow's form flickered again and I heard something soft, almost like a voice. It wasn't speaking exactly. It was more like a hum, vibrating in my bones, echoing in my mind. Then I understood. The key. It wasn't meant to open the door to death, not in the way I had thought. It wasn't about unleashing hell or bringing the dead back to life. It was about balance, about closing what had been opened long ago, before any of us had been born. I could feel the weight of it now, the history, the power that pulsed through the ancient metal. The key had chosen me, not as a curse, but as a guardian. I hadn't set something terrible free. I had been given the chance to stop it. The shadow's hand remained outstretched, waiting. And then, with a deep breath, I placed the key in its palm. For a moment, nothing happened. The air was still, and the cemetery seemed frozen in time. The dead, half risen from their graves, stood motionless, their eyes wide and empty. Then the shadow began to change. It shimmered, its dark form growing brighter, lighter, as if the very essence of it was dissolving into the air. The cold that had gripped the night began to lift, replaced by a warmth I hadn't felt since we'd entered the cemetery. The shadow was no longer terrifying. It was peaceful, and as it faded completely, I saw something that took my breath away. The dead, all of them, every corpse that had risen from the earth, were returning to their graves. Slowly, gently, they lowered themselves back into the ground, their bodies no longer twisted with decay and rot. They looked almost human again, their faces serene, as if they were finally being laid to rest for the first time. The graves closed over them, the earth sealing itself without a sound. The fog lifted, and the night sky became clear, the moon shining down brightly, casting a soft glow over the cemetery. The air was still, but it wasn't the oppressive silence that had haunted us before. It was the silence of peace. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see the key still there, but it was gone. It had vanished along with the shadow, its purpose fulfilled. The gates to the underworld hadn't been opened. They had been sealed. I collapsed onto the ground, the weight of everything hitting me all at once. Kara, Ethan, Davis, they were gone, but somehow I felt like they hadn't been lost forever. Like the cemetery had taken them, yes, but not to the place of torment I had feared. They were somewhere else now, somewhere beyond my reach, but at peace. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky, but there was a lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt before. The nightmare was over. Whatever curse had plagued this place was broken, and I had survived. As I made my way toward the cemetery gates, the dawn began to break on the horizon, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. The cold, terrifying darkness that had consumed the night was gone, replaced by a warmth that seemed to touch everything around me. I stopped for a moment, turning back to look at the old cemetery one last time. The graves were still, the mausoleum quiet. The dead were at rest, and so was I. The legend of the graveyard key had been real, but not in the way we'd thought. It hadn't been about unleashing the apocalypse. It had been about protecting the balance between life and death, about closing a door that had been open far too long. And as I walked out of the cemetery and into the light, I knew one thing for sure. I had faced death, and I had won. Somehow, against all odds, it was over, and I was free.